Daniel Cross had been hauling cargo through the outer sectors for 15 years, which meant he'd learned to mind his own business when it came to other species' customs. Everyone had traditions that seemed strange to outsiders, and getting involved usually created more problems than it solved. So when he docked his small freight ship at Velschen Station for routine resupply, he planned to be gone within a day, load his next cargo shipment and move on. He was 43, had been running independent cargo since leaving corporate shipping, and preferred the solitude of space travel to the complications of crowded stations. He'd seen enough of humanity's social complexities that spending weeks alone in transit actually felt peaceful rather than isolating. While waiting for his cargo to be loaded, Daniel wandered through the station's public areas, killing time before departure. That's when he encountered the marriage dock. The Velsharans were known for elaborate courtship and marriage traditions. Their culture placed enormous emphasis on youth and beauty, with very specific age parameters for when individuals were considered suitable for marriage. The marriage docks were places where families presented their unmarried members to potential spouses, arranged through complex social negotiations. What caught Daniel's attention was a Velsharan woman sitting alone on a marriage dock platform, dressed in traditional bridal attire but with no attendants, no family, and no prospective spouse approaching. She was perhaps 40 in human equivalent years, which Daniel knew was considered well past their traditional marriage age. Station personnel and passing Velsharans carefully avoided looking at her, treating her presence with deliberate blindness that suggested deep cultural shame. Daniel watched for several minutes, confused. A passing station worker, human like Daniel, explained when asked. The woman was Saras Velmara, left at the marriage dock by her family as final formality before they formally disowned her. Velsharan culture dictated that unmarried individuals past a certain age were shameful failures. Saras had reached the absolute limit of acceptable marriage age without finding a spouse, so her family had brought her here one final time as ceremonial gesture. The expectation was that she'd sit there for the required 6 hours during which anyone could theoretically claim her as spouse, but everyone understood no one would. After the time ended, she'd be formally unmarried and disowned, left to make her own way as a social outcast. Daniel found this custom cruel. Why hasn't she found a spouse before now? The worker explained that Velsharan marriage was highly competitive and status-focused. Saras had apparently had prospects when younger, but a family financial reversal reduced her desirability. By the time her family's fortunes recovered, she was considered too old. She'd spent 15 years in a declining spiral of fewer prospects as she aged past cultural preferences. Daniel observed Saras more carefully. She sat with remarkable dignity despite obvious humiliation, her posture straight, her expression composed. She wasn't crying or showing visible distress, though subtle color shifts in her skin, a Velsharan emotional indicator, suggested profound sadness beneath controlled exterior. There was something in her bearing that spoke to quiet strength rather than defeat, even in circumstances designed to be maximally shameful. Daniel found himself angry at the casual cruelty, a person being publicly discarded because they didn't fit arbitrary age parameters, their worth completely dismissed based on cultural timelines that seemed designed to create artificial scarcity and hierarchy. Almost without conscious decision, Daniel found himself approaching the marriage dock. The station worker tried to warn him off. Getting involved could create diplomatic complications, and besides, what would be the point? Saras was about to be formally disowned, but Daniel wasn't thinking about complications. He was thinking about a person sitting alone, being publicly rejected, and how no one deserved that regardless of age or cultural circumstances. Daniel approached the marriage dock platform where Saras sat. She noticed his approach, her expression shifting to confusion. A human approaching a Velsharan marriage dock was unusual. Station security also noticed and started moving toward the dock, probably concerned about potential cultural disruption. Daniel addressed Saras directly in standard galactic. I apologize for my directness, but I understand you're at the marriage dock awaiting potential spouses. Is the dock open to any species, or only to Velsharans? Saras's confusion deepened, but she answered with careful formality. Traditionally, the marriage dock is open to any who wish to make a claim, though in practice only Velsharans participate in Velsharan marriage customs. If I were to claim you as spouse according to Velsharan custom, would that claim be legitimate? Saras stared at him, clearly trying to process why a human would even ask this. Yes, technically, any formal claim made at the marriage dock during the traditional waiting period would be binding according to Velsharan law. Then Daniel did something that shocked everyone witnessing. He formally claimed Saras as his spouse, speaking the traditional Velsharan words. He'd learned them from a hastily accessed database, and his pronunciation was probably terrible, but the intent was clear. Saras froze in shock. Station security stopped their approach, uncertain how to handle a situation that was technically following custom but completely unprecedented. A crowd gathered, including several Velsharans who looked outraged. A Velsharan elder approached the dock, clearly intending to challenge the claim. Daniel stood his ground, stating clearly that he'd made a formal marriage claim according to Velsharan custom during the appropriate waiting period, and expected it to be honored according to their law. The elder argued that the custom was for Velsharans, that a human claiming a Velsharan bride was inappropriate and possibly insulting. Daniel countered that Saras herself had confirmed the dock was open to any species, that Velsharan law didn't specify species restrictions on marriage claims, and that if they refused his claim, they were essentially admitting their own customs were arbitrary and meaningless. This created a diplomatic problem. If they rejected a legitimate claim made according to their own rules just because they didn't like who was making it, they undermined their entire marriage system. But accepting a human's claim on a Velsharan bride, already considered worthless by their standards, was also culturally problematic. The elder demanded to know why Daniel would make this claim. What did he hope to gain? Daniel's answer was straightforward. I watched her sitting alone, being publicly rejected by her own people, and I found it cruel. She deserves better than being discarded because of arbitrary age restrictions. I'm not mocking your customs. I'm using your customs to prevent what I see as an injustice. If Velsharan marriage law allows me to claim her, then I'm claiming her, and you can either honor your own laws or admit your customs are meaningless. Throughout this confrontation, Saras hadn't spoken. She was watching Daniel with an expression that suggested she was trying to understand his motivations. The elder reluctantly conceded that the claim was technically legitimate. However, he warned that marriage between species was complex, that Velsharan marriage came with specific obligations and expectations. Daniel asked Saras directly, "Will you accept my claim? You have the right to refuse it according to Velsharan custom." Saras studied him for a long moment. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" Daniel's answer was honest. "I want nothing except to prevent you from being abandoned like you're worthless. I'm not expecting anything from you beyond basic civility. If you accept my claim, we'll figure out what our marriage means together." Saras accepted the claim. Her voice was quiet but firm, stating the traditional words that constituted acceptance of a marriage proposal. The crowd's reaction was mixed: outrage from some Velsharans, fascination from others, and complete bafflement from the station's human population. The marriage was formalized through a brief ceremony conducted by the elder, who made his disapproval clear even as he followed the required rituals. According to Velsharan law, Daniel and Saras were now married. Daniel's cargo ship was cramped, utilitarian, clearly lived in by someone who spent most of their time alone. He apologized for the conditions, explaining his ship's limitations, and offered Saras the small sleeping cabin while he'd take the cargo bay. Saras was quiet, still processing what had happened. She asked Daniel again in private why he claimed her. What did he actually want? Daniel sat down and explained more fully. I've spent 15 years in space mostly alone, and I've seen a lot of different cultures' customs. Some I respect, some I find strange but harmless, and some I find needlessly cruel. Watching you being abandoned at that dock fell into the last category. He paused. I know this creates complications. We're married now according to your culture's law, but we're strangers from different species. I don't have a clear plan for what comes next. I just knew I couldn't watch someone be discarded like that without doing something. What do you expect from our marriage? Daniel admitted he wasn't entirely sure. I know Velsharan marriage involves specific obligations. Spouses are expected to support each other financially and socially. But I also know our circumstances are unusual. I'm willing to provide for you as my spouse, to share my life and my ship with you. But I don't expect you to pretend feelings you don't have or fulfill obligations you're not comfortable with. We'll figure out what our marriage means as we go. Saras was quiet, then told Daniel about herself. I'm 43 in Velsharan years, 5 years past what my culture considers the absolute maximum acceptable marriage age. I was engaged twice when younger, but both engagements were broken when my family's financial situation changed. As I got older and remained unmarried, I became increasingly unmarriageable. She paused. The shame of my unmarried status reflected on my family, creating pressure that led to them eventually abandoning me at the marriage dock. She explained she was trained in Velsharan domestic management and financial administration, skills that were supposed to make her valuable as a spouse, but she'd never actually applied them. I'm telling you this so you understand what you've actually gotten: a spouse with no resources, no connections, and no practical experience despite my training. Daniel's response was pragmatic. My ship doesn't need domestic management in the Velsharan sense. It's too small for that. But having another person aboard could actually be useful. I've been running cargo solo for 15 years. If you're willing to learn the basics of cargo hauling and ship maintenance, you could contribute meaningfully to our partnership. He continued, as for resources and connections, I'm not wealthy myself. I make enough to maintain my ship and cover expenses. If you can accept a fairly simple, working-class existence aboard a small cargo ship, then we'll figure it out together. Saras accepted this proposal. Over the following weeks, they began the awkward process of learning to live together. Saras learned cargo operations, inventory management, operating loading systems, performing routine maintenance. Daniel learned about Velsharan emotional communication through skin color changes, their dietary requirements, and their cultural frameworks. 3 months into their unexpected marriage, they developed a working partnership that was evolving into something more. Saras had proven herself competent, taking on responsibilities that genuinely made Daniel's work easier. She'd organized his chaotic inventory systems, negotiated better rates using skills from her financial training, and maintained ship systems with meticulous attention. She'd also become a companion in ways Daniel hadn't appreciated he was missing after 15 years of solitary travel. Having someone to talk to during long transits, someone to share meals with, someone to help troubleshoot problems. It changed his daily experience from isolated routine to shared enterprise. For Saras, the transformation was even more dramatic. She'd gone from being a shameful burden to being a valued partner. The skills she was taught to make her attractive as a bride now had practical application. She wasn't just decorative or symbolic. She was actually contributing to their shared success. 6 months after their marriage, when they docked at a station with significant Velsharan population, Saras encountered some members of her former social circle. Their reactions were complex. Shocked she was still alive and not destitute. Surprised she was working as a cargo hauler's spouse. Visible discomfort with how she was thriving. Saras handled the encounter with composure, explaining she'd found a life that valued her contributions rather than measuring her by arbitrary age standards. When one suggested she must be so grateful a human was willing to take her in, Saras corrected them firmly. My husband chose me, not out of pity but because he saw worth that my own people missed. That evening, back on the ship, Saras thanked Daniel for something specific. Not just for claiming her at the dock, but for treating her like a partner rather than a charity case. Velsharan culture was so focused on youth and status that people in her position were often treated as if they'd failed at being worthy people. Daniel had never treated her that way. Daniel's response revealed his own perspective. I claimed you because I was angry at the injustice, but I've come to genuinely value our partnership. You're not a burden I'm carrying. You're a capable person who was given a chance to apply her abilities. If anything, my life is better with you in it. This conversation led to a shift from pragmatic partnership to something more emotionally intimate. They'd been married by law for months, but they began developing the emotional connection that made the marriage feel real. A year after their marriage, they returned to Velshan Station. Word had spread about the human trader who married an unmarriageable Velsharan woman and how she was thriving. It had become controversial. Conservative Velsharans saw it as proof humans didn't understand their culture, while progressive Velsharans pointed to it as evidence their marriage customs needed reform. When Daniel and Saras arrived, they were approached by several young Velsharan women approaching the age where they'd be considered too old for marriage. These women wanted to meet Saras, to understand how she built a life after being rejected. Saras spoke to them honestly about her experience, the shame of being unmarried past acceptable age, the humiliation of the marriage dock, but also the unexpected liberation of finding that life didn't end just because Velsharan culture said she'd failed. She'd found purpose, partnership, and value in a life that didn't conform to their expectations. Some elders criticized this conversation, suggesting Saras was undermining their cultural values. But Daniel pointed out that he didn't create the situation, he just responded to it. If Velsharan culture was going to discard people as worthless based on arbitrary age standards, they couldn't complain when those people found worth and happiness outside their cultural framework. The story ended with Daniel and Saras having fully integrated their lives. Their partnership was successful. Their relationship had deepened into genuine love neither expected, and they'd become unintentional symbols of how rigid cultural standards could miss the actual worth of individuals. Saras reflected that being left at that marriage dock was the worst day of her life, the culmination of years of shame and rejection. But it was also the day she met Daniel, the day someone chose her not despite her age or reduced status, but simply because he saw her as a person who deserved better. That choice had changed everything. Daniel reflected that he'd acted on impulse, motivated by anger at injustice rather than any clear plan. But that impulsive choice had given him a partner, a companion, and eventually a genuine love that enriched his life. A reminder that worth is not defined by age, status, or cultural approval, but by being seen and chosen without conditions. That sometimes the most meaningful relationships begin with someone refusing to accept another person's devaluation, and that challenging unjust customs can create opportunities for genuine connection that rigid traditions would never allow.